we get that question, and then we come back to, we go to you, and we take another question.
I wasn't referring to you, Grant.
I just wanted to have a little discussion about the fact that we are, this is an action group, I'm part of Battersea Residents Action Group. The word action, we need to do something here, because I think all of us are on the same page. We all think this is absolutely ridiculous, mainly because none of these buildings, I think, or certainly north of York, actually support communities. And that's the problem. And I hate the way that the word affordable housing is bandied around, because affordable housing is what? 70% of the local market value, 80% of the local market value. That's ridiculous. It should be called social housing, because 80% of market value is still way too expensive. If we want a proper society, a proper community in this area, then it needs to be a mix. We can't have this kind of social cleansing that goes on. How many Wandsworth families, people, are in temporary accommodation? It's about 500 families, and we are shipping people off to different parts of the country. It seems daft that you have that many people in temporary accommodation squeezed into hostels, when in fact there is technically all this space for development. And actually I think that's sickening, to be fair. So I, oddly, just this week, was privy to this, the A to Z of Planning and Culture produced by Boris. And in it, it has some information about the Localism Act and how it gives communities the power to develop a shared vision for their neighbourhood for the first time. Through neighbourhood planning, communities now have the power to prepare plans that have legal weight, grant planning permission for development, a neighbourhood development order, and access extra funding through the community infrastructure levy. So CIL, we could, in fact, if we formed neighbourhood groups, actually have control of that spending ourselves. And then we could veto the bridge. We could undermine all of the planning foibles that seem to have cropped up, that they believe that the bridge is an asset for the community. Also, assets of community value. This has been used a lot for pubs. Can we not use it for things like, for example, if the Royal School of Ballet is moving into home base, what happens to their current site at Battersea Square? It gets redeveloped. It's going to get redeveloped, isn't it? In Battersea Square. That's another piece of part of a community that's being lost. There's the old social club just off Battersea High Street. That's now going to be flat. Shouldn't that have been an asset of community value? Isn't there a way that we can actually try to work a little bit more cleverly around some of the acts and around some of the stuff that's out there, where we can actually be perceived as people who give a shit rather than NIMBYs?
Can I just make one very quick comment? It's not the Royal School of Ballet. The Royal Ballet School is something quite different up Talgarth Road. And this is important. It's the Royal Academy of Dance. It's an international organisation. It's the organisation that actually examines people doing ballet all over the world. So it also has a degree course, etc. But if the Royal Ballet School finds its name taken in vain, I think they might be a bit upset.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
I'm Brian Barnes, and Tony's mentioned that we've been banging around our station for 40 years, but actually it was only 30 years. 10 years before that, we were banging away about the Morgan Crucible site, the ones at Gasworth site, Gargle.
Let the microphone 2 miles.
Gargle site. Is it working?
Is it turned on?
Okay, start again. So the first 10 years it was about other sites along the riverfront, and don't ever give up, because you know we've got the riverside walk for a start. You know that's something that's maybe the only thing we've ever achieved, which is going to planning inquiries and UDPs and saying we want a 6-metre wide riverside walk along the river throughout Wandsworth. So that's mainly happening now. in Lombard Road. But we are still, as Victor said, it is massively difficult to follow all the variations of plans that developers put forward. So you might object to one plan 1 year, and the next year they bring out another set of variations. And on Battersea Power Station, there were 600 documents on one site alone. So, how can you possibly do that? So what's really needed is somebody who's paid to look at developments on behalf of the local community. And I would like to ask Tony how many planning officers there are at Wandsworth Council now, because of all the cuts. When I was there last, I saw 3 in the planning department. And of course the developer's got hundreds of people working for them. So, they've got lawyers, they've got planners, they've got advisors, they've got lobbyists. They all work for the developer against local people's interests. And they will always find ways of not building so-called affordable housing. In our case, it's because they're going to pay for the tube station. The tube station only benefits them. That's all it does. It comes to their site and then brings all the people to their shopping mall. So they should pay for it. But they use that as an excuse to not build any affordable housing. So the only thing I can say is all the sites need a little group to get together, a small group, and to meet every fortnight and to look at your site which you're interested in and to oppose it or agree with it, however you feel, and just set up action groups, basically. Probably an old-fashioned term now, community group, whatever you call it. And perhaps Tony could say how many planners you've got.
Thank you.
I can say something about it.
Well, immediately.
No.
We are going to take a few more questions before asking Tony to answer. I saw some here.
I'd just like to pick up on 1 or 2 things. I've lived in Battersea most of my life, at least two-thirds of it. I'm not going to tell you how long that is, but it's long enough. I care about this community. I care about the people who live here. And there'll be a couple of comments today I'd just like to pick up on. One is, I do not believe this is a party political issue. I think this is about everybody who lives in Wandsworth, in this particular case in Battersea. Whether they live on the Winton Stanley estate or the other side of York Road, it's not us and them, we're one community. And we need to get together to work on this together. If everybody has the same objective, then we can achieve something. But if we start making it a party political issue, then I don't think we will succeed.
A couple of things. One on planning consultation. Sorry, I'm Jane. I live in Petergate, which is this side of York Road, up by the roundabout, in the old houses. We don't get notification of planning applications, and quite a few of the people in the street, being very old Battersea residents, going back families of 100 years or so, are not on the internet. But in fact, I registered on the internet to be notified of planning applications within my area. I don't get them. They don't come up. I've re-registered. I still don't get them. And I don't know whether I'm supposed to check in every day or every week or whatever. But the last time we did anything in the street, I actually came across it yesterday, it was 2011, when we did object to some of the Battersea Reach developments, because that's been done in a very sneaky sort of way. The first lot went up, then another lot went up, then another lot went up, and I think it was only sort of at one stage we found out about the next phase and put in an objection, which was that lot which was completely ignored. Now, one of the worries about that is who is living in those flats in Battersea Reach. We look at those every night, and there are a load of them which are not lit up, never lit up. We know that they're, as someone said, pied-à-terres or they're foreign investors, they're tenanting and so on. And at the same time, we have Wandsworth Council talking about rehousing elderly people. I don't know whether I classify it. It's a Southend, is it, or somewhere like that? And rehousing families to Birmingham. This brings me really to what really concerns me is the street I live in is a very, very stable street. We have people come in, we have young families come in, but it is a community, and all the developments are breaking up the community. Now, what the problem is, that you can't actually evaluate the cost of breaking up communities. I mean, I know when I broke my leg that I was supported by the people in the street. If I hadn't been supported by those people in the street, presumably I would have been a greater burden on the National Health Service and social services because I couldn't cope living on my own. And this goes right across the board, that sort of stability in communities doesn't count. We've spent a lot of time training the newbies who've moved into the block of flats in greeting people and being part of the community. But one of them was saying today they weren't tricked or treated because, of course, they've got a gate on their thing so that people can't get into it. But it does mean that we have that sort of breakdown of community with short-term lets, people coming and going, you don't know who's who, and that is ordered across. Finally, with the York Road, I mean, there's buildings, is of course, as someone else has mentioned, the whole pollution level. I mean, it's bad enough. We have enough dirt along York Road. The pollution levels are just going to be shooting up.
Hi, I'm a resident at the Candlemakers. I wanted to raise a specific point using the home-based site as an example. On the question of the Planning Applications Committee and predetermination, how can you maintain a policy of predetermination not being allowed when the developer hires a former Wandsworth councillor as a lobbyist and the former Tory Wandsworth councillor as a lobbyist, and then the Planning Applications Committee vote is split Tory and Labour? So, I mean, that impression to residents, 120 plus have been objected to that scheme with no one in favour, just gives a massive impression of collusion, and I just don't see how you can claim that predetermination hasn't occurred in that process. The other point I wanted to raise was in relation to affordable housing. Developers use the term economically unviable quite often. I've seen it come up in relation to at least half a dozen large schemes. Who defines what is economically unviable for a developer? Do the council ever scrutinise that? I know there was an example in the last 12 months at Elephant Castle where a developer was allowed to drastically reduce the amount of affordable housing, saying it was economically unviable, and then the council found out how much money they were making, with tens of millions, and had to sort of go, oh, we made a mistake, we've learned from that, we won't let that happen again. So how much scrutiny is there over what actually economic viability means for a developer who, if they're building 250 flats, most of which will go for around about $1 million, let's say average, where's the economic viability in putting in decent amounts of affordable housing, genuinely affordable housing?
Other questions. We are just going to comment a little bit. I just wanted to make two points. I'm not going to address everything because Tony Belton and Philip White and maybe Andrew, if you want to say a few things, will be able to answer probably better. On the non-political issue that was raised, I've got a lot of contacts, for example, with the they are currently in the process of building one of the first neighborhood plan in central London. And they are actually fighting against a Labour council over there. So it's really not really a political issue. It's more an issue with the residents, making sure that they are heard. On economic viability, there were a few very good articles in The Guardian before the summer, and one was explaining that basically the economic viability says it's just you take an assumption on the value of the units that you are going to sell when they will be ready, and then you subtract the cost of construction, you subtract the cost of the architect and over admin cost, and you subtract the cost of your, well, it's not, you subtract the profit, and the profit is actually, in that equation, apparently not a variable that can adjust depending on the scheme, but the developer are fixing it to something like 15, 20, 25%, and as it has been seen in some areas in London, which is much better than any derivatives or financial investment that you got nowadays. So currently, it seems that the only adjustment that you can do on economic viability is actually put it on the level of affordable accommodation, and that's the reason why in so many developments you've got currently 10, 5 or even 0 affordable accommodation, because developers are just saying that in order to safeguard their profit, then it's not viable to have any affordable accommodation.
Thanks. Starting with my department, Brian, you and I both go back quite a long way to when I was the chair of the planning committee. God knows how long that was ago, and it was pretty big. So many local government cuts since. It's not a separate department now, it's a section within a section within a section of the department. I think I've got the number of sections right. So it just doesn't do the same things that it did 40 years ago. It checks out, if that's the right word, perhaps slightly more than that, planning applications. But in terms of the macro planning that I think lots of us are talking about, like how many schools there should be, and how many health centres, and how many this, that, and the other, it ceased doing that effectively a long time ago. But one shouldn't be as negative about it as I think some people are. When the council's not thick, councils, even if I disagree with much of it, has thought about lots of these things before. So, for instance, there are a couple of schools planned in Nine Elms Lane, and one of the developers is planning for them. I mean, it is aware of these issues. There's also a health centre in one of the applications, can't remember which. So, you know, I don't think one should be totally negative about their contribution. Predetermination. Predetermination means you're not allowed to go into the planning committee, at least in theory, you're not allowed to go into the planning committee before having heard the arguments, and before having heard, it's a bit like a jury, before having heard what the officer's advice may be, saying, I'm definitely going to vote against X or for Y. You're not allowed to take that predetermined position. That's what you're referring to, isn't it? So how come we appear to be predetermined and we vote according to party blocks? Well, first of all, we don't. The last planning committee, I voted with the majority party members about a planning application in Nine Elms Lane, and my colleagues went the other way, and it was reversed on something else. So we don't in other senses, I think it is true to say that Conservative Party members are more inclined to accept the argument there is a housing crisis, we need to put more, the gentleman's argument over there, if you like, numbers. We need to go up higher because that's where we get more people in. Maybe a bit crude, but I think it's fair to say that they're more inclined to take that position than we are. I don't call that predetermination. By the way, and can I add just to Cyril's argument? Because all this has got so technical, I do remember years ago we'd say there are not enough affordable housing, whatever that meant, to the officers, and they'd go back and argue with it. Now, of course, you get legally challenged and all sorts of things, and we have an official advisor, BNP, Bank National BNP Paribas, who looks at all the figures, makes the assessment of whether it's viable, comes back to us and tells us that it is viable or it isn't viable. I would say, get on to the gentleman's question about politics in a minute, I would say as a lefty, clearly, if you're going to ask a banker to do that, you'll get the answer you expect. If you ask the trade unionists to do that, you might get a different answer. That's one of the problems, which is where I get to politics, in a way. I mean, you smiled yourself, it depends who you ask. I didn't mean to be crudely, if I gave that impression, I apologise. There are rotten Labour councillors around, I didn't mean to be that. But I think you're kidding yourself if you don't recognise this is a political issue. If you like stricter party politics, the distribution of housing in this country is a political issue. And the division of wealth and affluence in this country is a political issue, in my view. And there's no way getting around that. There's two extremes, obviously moderate positions in the middle there's an extreme which says less taxation the better. And in my view, that means that people are not able to look after. You can't get around this. And I believe that so strongly that if you want a fairer, more honest position about housing and housing development, you don't have to agree with me or disagree with that Tory councillor sitting next to you, because maybe he's got good views on that. But in a sense, not party political perhaps, but genuinely at root of it political.
Can I just make two comments about Battersea Bridge to start with, lady sitting just in front of there? The reason that you probably wouldn't have been notified in significant parts of the development, because originally